he's a prophet. But the Jews didn't believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight, and they asked them, saying, "Is this your boy, who they say was born blind? How then does he now see?" And his parents answered them and said, "Well, we know this is our son, and that he was born blind, but what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know. He's of age, why don't you ask him?" That makes sense, don't it? "And he will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed that he, Jesus, was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He's of age, will you ask him?" And so again they called a man who was blind and said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." Now give God the glory, not give Jesus the glory. We know that he's a sinner. And he answered and said, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know." And then maybe the famous line in this passage. "One thing I do know, though, I was blind and now I what?" Don't you know that was an exciting moment? I don't think we render that clearly enough. I just know one thing. I don't even know who this Jesus is. I've never seen him. People around me tell me his name is Jesus. And all I know, once I was blind, now I see. And they said to him again, "Well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He said, "I told you already and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become one of his disciples?" That's a funny moment. He's asking the disciples, "Hey, you looking for him? You want to be one of his followers? Hey, that's cool, that's good." And then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we're Moses' disciples, and we know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know even where he's from." And the man answered and said to them, "Why, this is a marvelous thing that he's done to me, that you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Don't we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone's a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him? And since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of one who was born blind." Doesn't that prove that he's not a sinner? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered to him, "You were completely born in sin, and you were teaching us." So they cast him out of the synagogue, threw him out of church. Now in verse 35, and Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And he said, "Yes." "So who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who's talking to you." Then he said, "Lord, what? I believe." And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into the world, that those who don't see, who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind." Then some of the Pharisees who were with him, they said these words, and they said to him, "Are we blind also, us Pharisees? You're saying we are blind?" Jesus said to him, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say we see. Therefore your sin remains." The title of tonight is True Vision or True Blindness. So let's go back and just talk through this story a little bit now that we've read it all and we're freshed up on that. As we start out in verse 1 there, as Jesus passed by him, he says on his way, I don't know where he was going, but he was going somewhere. Having the eyes of Jesus, he sees this blind man from birth. He went looking for him. He found him, spoke to him. Oh, to have the eyes of Jesus. This blind man was relegated to sitting at the gate and begging all the rest of his life. That's a lowly spot on the human scale. But when Jesus walked by, he looked at him and he took his time and he saw him. Isn't that amazing? We need to have the eyes of Christ as we watch our world play out before us. Do we continually have a world view that looks through the eyeglass of the Bible and the eyeglass of the words of Christ, and we watch his life, is that how we're looking at people around us? Are we looking for someone like Jesus was? We're not told the spiritual condition of that young man when Jesus first met him. One thing we know that Jesus is full of mercy and his grace, and he doesn't seek to destroy, but to encourage, comfort, change his destiny. Now, when Jesus had dealt with this young man, we'll come back. When we get to verse 35, we'll see some more things. Now, Jesus passed by, and having the eyes of himself, he saw this man, and Jesus was going somewhere. Don't know where he was going, but as he was going, he watches all the time. So we're to be about the business of Christ, but as we go, so that means as we do everything throughout, the hour clock clicks through the day, and wherever we're at, are we in a crowded place or wherever, as we go, we have those eyes of Christ, and we're looking for people, and we're saying, how can I touch that person's life? It's an amazing story. So, in verse 2, though, guess what happens then? Jesus runs into this young man, and when Jesus puts his interest on somebody, you know what happens to all those people that are around him? They get interested. Jesus got interested in this born blind young man, so they jump in and they get interested. But then they have this strange question. Remember what they said? The disciples have a very strange question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? First thing they think of. Obviously, somebody sinned here. Well, it's not too... The Jews thought he must have inherited the sin of the father. And we can read some things about that back in Exodus, but that what came to their mind. Certainly this man must be blind because of the sins of the father. Or maybe it was just Adam's sin that passed on to the whole human family, and therefore it's just subject to disease, and he went blind, and he was blind from birth. Maybe that's it. I've read where the Jews perhaps felt like sometimes the child could sin in the womb. Well, they had some notions, and so they begin to ask these questions. They take it for granted that he was punished for something, for some kind of wickedness of his own or his parents. Who are the criminals? What good would it have done that if they knew it? Wouldn't have done them any good, would it, if they knew it, but they ask it. Do you agree that maybe we are apt to be more curious about other people's sins than concerning our own? What do you think? Are we quick to get interested in your sin and we can let mine slip by and hope you don't see it? I think we are. To judge ourselves is our duty. To judge our brother is our sin. So they just come up with these questions, and Jesus is answering them. He said, and in verse 33 to 5, he said, this man didn't sin, nor his parents sinned. So that's simple. But his blindness is so the works of God will be revealed through this young man. That's the answer. Jesus was busy about the work of his Father that had sent him to do. Time's short. He's got to be busy. He's about to leave. And so that's the answer to this. God's going to do a work through this man who was born blind. What an amazing thing. In verse 6 and 7, so Jesus goes about the work of healing this man's eyes. This is the strangest thing here. I hate that clock. You know what he did? Remember what he did? A strange method. He spit on the ground, and he took that up, and he made this clay-looking stuff, and then he covered his blind eyes so he would be more blind. Now, I think there's a reason for that. And matter, I was so glad to read this, that he made this this clay thing, and he put them on his eyes. And I think maybe my mama had a reason to use Denver mud to put on where I got splinters and glass all in my feet and hands, and they'd wrap it up and it would just fix it. You've probably never heard of Denver mud. Well, I'll go on. Let's go on. This would sure close his eyes more rather than open them. I have to tell you, don't try this at home unless Jesus tells you to do this, because it's not a good deal. Only God can make a concoction like this that'll open the eyes. So why cover the eyes more? To make men feel themselves blind and give them sight. To be saved, one must know he's lost first. He knew he was physically blind, but there was something about knowing his eyes are covered, no chance of ever seeing now, until he obeyed Jesus. And that's what we find in verse 7. God instructs him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and he did it, and he came back what? Seeing. Washed that mud out of his eyes. And he came back seeing. It's an amazing thing. To come to Christ, one must come believing and obeying. There's two things you got to do. You got to believe him, but you got to obey him, don't you? And that's what the young man did. Then in verses 8 to 12, the neighbors began to question him. Are you the same man that was blind? I am. How were your eyes opened? Now, he's got a story there, doesn't he? A man they called Jesus made this clay covered by blind eyes. I obeyed him and went and washed in the Siloam pool, and now I have sight. Well, where is he? I don't know. I've never seen him. Isn't that amazing? He just tell him how it happened. How many of you have had an encounter with Jesus and yet have never seen him? Everyone that's saved. Right? That was this man's testimony. I've never seen him. I don't know who. They say he's Jesus. And then in verse 13 and 16, much more happened that after he gained his sight. The Pharisees got a hold of him. They questioned his parents. Is this your son, born blind with birth? Yes. Well, how did that happen? Well, ask him. And they were upset that this had occurred on the Sabbath. That's what they were upset about. He did something wonderful on the Sabbath. It broke the law of Moses. They were more concerned about breaking the law than seeing a miracle of God wrought by the Son of God. I'll tell you a real quick story. Church we went to one time. We cultivated the friendship of this young couple that had moved to town. Wonderful young couple with some little children. Wonderful little family, Christian family. She wore breeches to church. The powers that be in the church were ready to ask them to change their ways, conform to the church laws, or leave. They asked them that. Huh? They wrote them a letter. Let's get this straight. Would you say they're kind of pharisaical in their belief? That seems almost impossible, today. I questioned some of those that were powers of the church. And I said, do you know if they're saved? You know what they said? Well, no, not really. We really don't even know these people. But she wears pants. And she breaks the law. And the Pharisee said to this young blind Jew, this man that healed you, he has to be a sinner because he did this on the Sabbath. Folks, don't let your pharisaical mindset ever destroy somebody like they try to destroy our friends. Be careful with that. The Pharisees asked what he had, so they asked him, they said, well, what do you have to say about Jesus? The young man said, well, he's a prophet. He must be a prophet to do this. They tell the young man to give God the glory because Jesus is a sinner. They certainly don't recognize that he's the Son of God. And remember how funny that sounded? He said, that's a wonderful answer. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, now I see. Why you guys want to be followers of him? So glad to hear it. Look what he did to me. Think what he's going to do for you Pharisees. Oh boy, don't you know that burned them to the core. He burned them to the core. And then he said, we go on in verse 28, 23. The Pharisees to the man. They said, well, you must be his disciple. But we're Moses's, and God spoke to Moses. As far as this man, Jesus, is concerned, we don't even know where he's from or nothing about him. We just know one thing, he heals people on the Sabbath. And the young man began to tell them, he said, well, isn't that a wonderful thing? From the beginning of the whole world, nobody's opened the eyes of the blind from birth. So he must be God. And so because of his testimony, they threw him out of the church. So in verse 35, we see Jesus coming along again. Now, Jesus hasn't seen him for a while. But he heard he got tossed out of the synagogue. And then he found him. He was looking for him, remember? I'm looking. I got the eyes of Christ. I'm looking as I go. And Jesus, hearing that the young man had been put out of the synagogue, looked for him and found him in verse 35. And then Jesus asked him a question about his belief. Do you believe in the Son of God? Brother Gary would have been so pleased with Jesus because he would have witnessed to those that came along, wouldn't he? Jesus has been through his little training on Sunday nights in here. He's got it down pat. That young man had stood strong in the face of the Pharisees because he had told them exactly what he thought of this man, Jesus. Who is he, Lord, that I might believe in him? And Jesus said, he said, do you believe in the Son of God? And he said, I don't know really who he is. And Jesus said, well, you've both seen him now, because now Jesus is talking to him and he sees now. Now when Jesus is talking to him, they're looking like this. First time he's ever seen Jesus. But he knows that Jesus was the one who sent him to the pool of Siloam. Amazing. And Jesus said, you've not only seen him, but you're talking to him. And then he said, Lord, I believe. Isn't that sweet? What a story. And Jesus is so wonderful. Isn't it amazing how Jesus can engineer his way into your life when you don't even know you need him? And you're just clicking along. Jesus comes along and said, what are you going to do with me? Didn't he? What are you going to do with Jesus? Well, personally, I'd never thought about it before. He said, yeah, but now I'm talking to you. What are you going to do with me? And so this young man was so excited about his life. And it's amazing how Jesus works his way into our lives and gives our attention. And when we don't even know we need him, and the urgency of how much we need him. And he opens our blind eyes to see by faith. Now that man was believing by faith, wasn't he? I've never seen you. You say you're the one. And you say, you're the one I'm talking to. I believe. And that's what you did one day. Same thing as the blind man. You were blind. Yeah. Verse 39, the true vision, true blindness now. We'll try to nail it down here. Jesus had come into the world for judgment, to set apart, make a difference, reveal the hearts of men. For example, the Gentiles in the world, they saw a great light when God began to reveal himself to them. And the Jews turned him away, stayed in their darkness. The Gentiles saw a great light, while the blindness happened to Israel, and their eyes were darkened, and their eyes are still darkened. They didn't believe him then, they don't believe him now. It's an amazing thing. What happened to their eyes? What happened to their accepting the Son of God? Because they got sealed up in their conceit of their wisdom and their knowledge. And they said, don't you know? Our father's Abraham. And they totally missed the truth of the story of Abraham, that he got the righteousness from God granted to him through faith, not the law of Moses. Amazing thing. The preaching of the cross had become foolishness to them. And in verse 4 he said, Are we blind also? The Pharisees spoke in jesting and cavalier manner. Jesus, are you telling me we're blind? Didn't we explain to you who we were, that we're of Moses? And God spoke to Moses. We don't know who this guy is. We obey the law. Our father's Abraham. Yes, Jesus said to them. Jesus says in verse 41, if you were blind, in other words, not guided by your strong, conceited, satisfied with their own way life, you perhaps would have been able to come to faith in me. But that was so strong, you know. In John 1:10-12, it says this, the true light which gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. And yet the world did not know him. He came into his own. Guess who that is? And his own people didn't receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. And they didn't even realize that God has winked during times of ignorance in the Old Testament and could have brought them to Christ. He says, if you had just been aware of your own blindness, you would soon have accepted Christ as your guide. But you were blinded in your own conceit. They were busy about seeing what seems right unto man. Remember the psalm that says, there's always a way that seems right unto man, but the way thereof is death. I spoke to a young man, Clay and I spoke to a young man in this neighborhood a couple of weeks ago. And we asked him if he knew Jesus. He said, no, not really. He said, I just kind of depend on, my own self. That's blindness. He's depending on a way that seems right, but the end of that is death. Right? And that's the story we have here. True vision says, I was blind, but now I see. That's the young man's story, isn't it? I was blind, but when Jesus interrupted my life, and he told me who he was, and I looked at him and I talked to him, I said, and I obeyed him, that's when my sight came. And now, Jesus, I believe in you. Makes sense, doesn't it? True blindness, that's true vision. True blindness says, I see, but I'm blinded to the truth of the gospel through whatever else has come my way. Maybe the law, maybe just dependent on yourself. How about us? How about you? What have you done with this man, Jesus? Do you see only a way that seems right unto man and are blinded to the truth of the gospel? Are you blinded to the truth that Jesus loves you, died for you, and wants you to be saved? And so for those that are out there on our internet tonight, that's our story of the gospel of Jesus. He's come that he might pay your sin debt, that you might come to trust him as your personal Lord and Savior. He's real. He's done this for you. You put your faith in him, you believe by faith, and you trust him as your personal Lord and Savior. You confess your sin, ask him to forgive you and save you. And you too will see. Once you were blind to the very fact, and Jesus didn't mean a thing to you. But now you see because you've come by faith in him. Amen? Yeah. So we invite you to think about that as we will do that here too. Thank you for being with us tonight on the internet. And thank you all for patiently listening. And so, as Clay says,